Now, in June, the Prime Minister asked MP Danny Kruger to look into ways in which the community spirit we saw during the first lockdown could become a more permanent part of our lives. In his report this week, the MP delivered a number of suggestions, including a call for the government to pursue a new deal with faith communities that embraces their religious values instead of disregarding them.
He suggested that religious illiteracy and a faith phobia meant that faith-based organisations were sometimes prevented from fulfilling their potential for good deeds within communities. But should religion be more entwined with all aspects of our society? And is it the role of faith groups to help us recover from the pandemic? Joining us to discuss the subject are journalist Shaista Aziz, Catholic priest Father Ged Murphy, Director of the religious think tank Theos, Elizabeth Oldfield, and President of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, Andrew Copson. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us. So, Elizabeth, do you think that Danny Kruger's right? Are we faith-phobic? Are we pushing religion out of public life? Or are people right to worry about increasing the role of faith groups in our increasingly secular society?
I don't think there's a kind of sinister plot to push religion out of public life. What I think is happening is we're getting more diverse, we're getting more plural. You know, church going is no longer the default. It just makes it more likely that people won't know any religious people. So they might not understand what they believe and they're just receiving media messages perhaps, rather than actually being able to encounter people in relationships. And on the same part of the same problem is religious people maybe feel a bit less confident. They maybe feel like because they're not so mainstream anymore, they don't know how to explain what they believe and all the amazing work they're doing in their communities. So there just is a bit of fear and a lack of understanding. What we're seeing up and down the country in up to 100 different case studies that we've been going to in the last few years doing research is actually when people partner together across these differences, which are really normal in a plural society. They're doing amazing work. So faith communities working with local councils, working with other charities, working with schools, you know, tackling holiday hunger, tackling debt and joblessness, as well as food banks, which we all know about. So I just think more understanding, more willingness to partner that we're already seeing can only be a good thing.
Shaista, you're a proud practising Muslim. You're also a local councillor. You do charity work. Do you agree with the suggestions in this report that faith organisations have more to offer and should play a bigger role?
Well, I think up and down the country, especially since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, communities are seeing how people of faith are coming together, how they're responding to hunger, to destitution, to loneliness. And so I think this has been going on for more than just over the pandemic. It's part and parcel of life. I think people are very compassionate and they do want to reach out to their neighbours and to members of their communities. But my concern about this report is that over the last 10 years, austerity has decimated public services. And I don't think that the government should expect volunteers, be they people of faith or people of no faith, to step in and plug those gaps. That's a very different situation to people wanting to extend the hand of friendship and charity to their communities and to the people around them.
Father Murphy, can you see why some people would be sceptical about religious organisations becoming too involved?
I can see why. There is no reason to be.
And why is that?
Well, the Catholic Church and other faith communities have been helping people over many, many generations. Right since the beginning of the church, Jesus instituted the gospel of love to share good news. That's what gospel means. And we try to live that in our lives. It's not just a Sunday thing. It happens each and every day of the week up and down the country.
And so I read in a Nesta report that some people were reluctant to take help from religious food banks because they felt it conflicted with their own faiths. And others felt that they were unhappy to have prayers said in front of them. How do you feel about that? What do you do?
There are prayers at our food banks and organisations, but people don't have to join in. It's completely voluntary, and people are never ever belittled and made to feel small. We try to build people up to help them to have a new beginning.
Andrew, Danny Kruger said in his report that religious groups' concern for the spiritual well-being of individuals and society provide a motivation and commitment that often exceeds that of paid professionals. So this idea that people want to help, people want to be there and give their time, that's actually better than paying someone to do it. It feels so much better to receive that sort of help. Faith communities are making a real difference here. We need these religious voices, don't we?
First of all, I think that comment does a disservice to people who are paid to work in the public service, whether social workers or teachers or nurses or community providers or citizens advice providers or others.
That was my fault. I pointed out to him, so I have a son with special needs, and you long, as a parent of a child with special needs, to have someone who wants to spend time with your child without being paid. Sometimes.
I understand that, but people often are motivated to go into those professions because they want to provide care and have a calling to that sort of service as well. But I understand the point you're making. Many service users do like to feel that they're the beneficiaries of people's voluntary help. Equally, many service users, as one of your previous questions pointed out, don't want to feel that they're the receipts of charity and would rather feel that they're in receipt of a service to which they're entitled as a citizen, just like the service provider, on the basis of equal dignity. But the second part of your question, in terms of what religious people provide, it's certainly true that religious organisations are an important part of the civil society in this country. They're not a major part of the voluntary and community sector. 2/3 of our voluntary and community sector is secular. They're organisations where people of different religions and beliefs work together. But they are an important part, and of course, they provide good services. I don't think, however, they should be brought in as part of the state to provide those services. I think that's when the risk of various different harms comes into play. And this isn't a particularly new question. Religious organisations have been taking on public service contracts in increasing numbers for the last 15 years. And when beneficiaries of those services come to us, or employees of those organisations that have been taken over come to us, they're presenting a much darker side of this situation than the positive one that you've heard. It's about discrimination in employment, people being contracted over to Christian organisations, then losing their jobs because they're not religious enough. It's about people who are taking welfare to work services, turning up to have the course provided and finding that instead of being provided by the state provider, it's being provided by a religious provider. They're suffering homophobia, they're suffering worship that makes them uncomfortable, as we've heard. So there's a much darker side to that. It's much better, I think, if the state keeps itself plural and diverse and inclusive in secular public services.
Father Ged, you're shaking your head, though. Although I'm a Christian and have strong support for faith groups, I really can see Andrew's point. Why are you shaking your head?
I have the privilege of working with an organisation in our diocese called Caritas, and a number of our employees are not of any Christian faith. Or indeed Catholic. We have a very diverse number of people who work for us and indeed volunteer for us. So everyone can be involved.
So you don't have to be a Catholic to volunteer with you, and you don't have to be a Catholic to receive the help?
Absolutely not. We do ask people to share the values that we're trying to live, and to help people to grow as children of God. That's our mission.
Elizabeth, lots of people getting in touch on social media. Sarah Talbot has got in touch on Twitter to say it's the army of volunteers, many of whom are from faith-based groups or individual faiths, who kept services going through lockdown. Now, 84% of the world have a faith. Can the world's problems be solved without religious intervention?
I think that these proposals coming out of Danny Kruger's office are really helpful and realistic because they're about all of civil society. There's only one section that is about faith communities. And as Andrew said, faith communities are this incredibly important engine of lots of things that we need to solve social problems. They have massive assets. They have convening power, do have a really strong volunteer base. They have often long-term vision where they'll stay in a community for decades, centuries even, apart from the funding cycles that charities sometimes have to wrestle with and that government programmes sometimes have to wrestle with, but they can't do it on their own. And so it's exactly right to say we have an amazing society, we have an amazing country full of people who want to help, what structural changes do we need to make to liberate them? And there's some things we can do around the role of faith, in fact, not giving them government contracts or more money in these proposals, but just saying we're going to get out the way and let you crack on with what you already do really well.
What is in the way at the moment, Elizabeth, in your view?
So I think that I wouldn't go so far as faith phobia. I think that there are concerns about things like inappropriate proselytism, or as Andrew said, about inclusivity, that my understanding and from our research is really more of a narrative than a reality on the ground. When we go to a local case study and we talk to the faith communities working to solve social problems, but also police chiefs, heads teachers, local councillors, when we ask the non-religious interviewees, do you have concerns? They'll say, yes, I do worry sometimes about proselytism, for example. And then we'll say, and can you point to concrete instances of inappropriate behaviour? And they'll go, no, I can't really. So I just think that expectation that there will be bad practice is just sometimes getting in the way. We have to remember that all charities fail, all organisations fail, including faith communities. But the vast majority of the work they do is appropriate, humane, unconditional, and loving.
Well, let's get Andrew to respond to that. I mean, to be fair, we're talking about these faith organisations which share many of the same values as humanism. So we're talking about community, compassion, loving your neighbour. What's the problem with them?
That sounds very appealing when you put it that way, doesn't it? And of course,
but you think about it, you are very similar, aren't you?
Well, all human beings are similar. If they have regard for other people in particular, they're going to express that in the same sort of way. And as I said at the beginning, we have an extremely thriving civil society in this country and community sector, a part of which is religious. And I completely agree that all moves to help anyone in any situation and for the mutual help that we need for a society to move along together is completely welcome. But the examples that I gave a moment ago of people who suffer harms when religious organisations have public responsibilities extended to them by the state are not theoretical. I'm not in a position of Elizabeth's research participants who can't think of real examples. We get real examples like this all the time. And so, what more can I say than that? It is a balance. And I think at the moment the balance is in the right direction. And I find it really difficult to believe that government or state services is somehow allergic to religion when we've had, as I said, a growing involvement over the 15 years of religion in our public services. And our biggest public service, the education system, a third of our state schools, completely state funded, are controlled by religious groups, which is the largest proportion in Europe. So I think that very often this argument, the government is faith-phobic, is actually brought out, as it is in Danny Kruger's report, as a sort of straw man to try and really shore up the privilege of existing groups rather than do anything new.
Thank you, Andrew. Shaista, we've taken a long time to come back to you. You play a huge part, obviously, in your local community, and you're a proud Muslim woman. From where you stand, do you see faith help being given with no strings attachment, or do you think it comes with significant downsides?
So I see two issues being conflated here. As I said in my first answer, we need a functioning welfare state that ensures that people have a safety net. We don't have that at the moment. It's been destroyed. We've got record numbers of people homeless, record numbers of people facing food poverty, including children going to school hungry. This is simply unacceptable. And so no number of volunteers, be they people of faith or people of no faith, is going to fix that. So the government needs to take responsibility about that. The second point about faith. Now, I am a woman of faith and I'm proud to be a person of faith, but I also understand that most faiths are interpreted through a patriarchal lens, and they do also cause harm because of the interpretation of how religion is put out there in society. So I think we need to be really aware that any help being offered to people has to be independent, and it has to be inclusive, and it has to address the bigotry that is sadly flourishing in our society.
Okay,
so I work for a domestic abuse charity, and I know many women in particular are locked out of receiving help from faith groups.
Okay, Shaista, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. It's
Thank you
really
so much.
Debate,
Thank you so much. It was really properly interesting and respectful debate. Hooray!